Welcome to part 2 of the Genesis story. We're going to be looking at Genesis from the start to the end of verse 3 of chapter 2, and I've entitled this The Overture. We all recognize what an overture is. All the main themes of the music are woven together. It gives kind of an overview, a warming up of what's going to come with the rest of the music. And this part of Genesis lays down the basic principles. And these principles underpin all the ensuing chapters in Genesis. It addresses some very fundamental questions. Who brought the world into being? What is the nature of humanity? Why do we exist? And how do we relate to the Creator? Now we must remember that this was written set against the background of ideas that already existed. There were numerous accounts in the Middle East at the time. And the writer here is trying to bring God's perspective against the background of all the competing ideas that existed in the societies of that time. And it was a long time ago. The exact date we do not know. But the second millennium BC, over 3,000 years ago, society was very different. And this account undermines and challenges many of the views that were currently in existence, that exist in documents that we possess today. Now, the way of communicating was storytelling. You see, in the modern day, we wouldn't do it this way. We'd present a logical, almost philosophical account of the origins of the universe. But that wasn't the way of that age. Most people couldn't read or write. And things were remembered by weaving great truths into a story. That's not to suggest the story is not true. But the most important thing is what the story is communicating, because that was the way communication took place at that time. In a different culture, in a different setting, and over 3,000 years ago. And it was certainly not written philosophically. And it wasn't written scientifically. And any attempts to try and find science in the text are doomed to failure. The authors were never guided that way. Science didn't exist at that time, and it wasn't a way of thinking that was in the cultures of those days. The picture presented is God, the creator of everything in the universe. He brings order out of disorder and sets in motion life itself. The whole pattern and the principles by which the universe runs and life itself are set in motion by God the Creator. And the place of man in that created order is presented, related to all the creation and related to God himself. That's the purpose of the writer, and he's done it by telling a magnificent story. Now there were other accounts, other stories, and I've looked at some of these and picked out some of their features. It's not a complete story, but just giving you some picture of what the other accounts were saying. They spoke of gods. They spoke of creation. They spoke of life, though not too much. They spoke of the origins of mankind. They spoke of the place of sex in life. But much of it was written to justify the power of the leaders of communities at that time. Let's look at this further. Gods were often pictured as parts of creation. So things are gods. And we still see that today. And there were multiple gods, and indeed gods created each other. That's in the other accounts and stories. The idea of creating out of nothing is not a strong feature. Creation is often seen as a kind of reorganization of what's there, and different bits were created and reorganized by different gods, different deities. No concept of one God doing it all. The origins of life are left pretty vague, but often it was seen as kind of magically coming out of water. And mankind? In some pictures we have a mixture of the blood of gods mixed up with the clay, the soil, and out of that came human beings. But frequently the human beings were created as a kind of afterthought, because the gods wanted food, and they didn't want the effort of making and gathering their own food. So human beings were created to generate the food. And that, of course, leads to practices today where, in certain religious settings, food is presented to representations of gods, such as idols. Gods had sex with each other, and they had sex with humans. And it was just a small step from that to get to cult prostitution, where worshipping a particular god meant having sex with the leaders around some temple or cult area. And that was a major problem that faced the people of Israel later on in their history, coming from the surrounding nations. But gods were presented as underpinning established power structures. Leaders kind of commissioned these stories, and the stories were written so that leaders could justify their position, justify their behavior, justify what they were doing. That's the picture, and it is oversimplified, but it's a broad brush picture of what some of the accounts at that time were saying, 2nd millennium BC. How does Genesis differ? One God, and we mentioned in the previous presentation 2 Hebrew words, Yahweh and Elohim, which together describe something of the nature of the one God, who created from nothing. And life was God's creative gift for the benefit of humanity. And we were the peak of creation spiritually. Sex was seen inside marriage, and the purpose was procreation. Pleasure and procreation, but inside marriage. And there was no mention of trying to defend any power structure on earth. It just doesn't exist in the Genesis account. We can see in this how this account, inspired by the Holy Spirit, comes against the accounts current at the time and was written for that purpose, and lays down the principles of the origins of this universe and life itself. In the context of that, let's look at the first verse, and whatever else we might say about these words, they are majestic. In the beginning, in the original language, is one word. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We noted before, Elohim, that's plural, but the verb is singular. In other words, God cannot be seen as a kind of Superman or in the image of man. God is beyond that. But the singular verb stresses that God is one. And he created from nothing the entire universe. Now remember, at that time, people saw the earth as flat, and they saw the sky as a kind of dome over the earth, and it was studded with the stars which you could see at night, and it was lit during the day by a sun that moved across the sky, and at night by a moon that also moved across the sky. That was their world. And they describe it that way with that imagery. We could put it that way. And we'd have captured the essential meaning. God created everything. Then it goes on to that. I'll put at the right-hand side the Hebrew. Now, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but you can see just looking at the words, there's a play on sound, tohu wabohu. So it would ring in people's minds. Remember, this would be spoken. People couldn't read or write in general. Be read to them, spoken to them. And as so often happens in the book of Genesis, the use of language is extremely clever and extremely subtle. And the subtle play on sounds to make people remember it. And it just basically means, formless and empty means in a mixed up state. Order had to come to it. The word for spirit and the word for wind are exactly the same word. That's true in both in Hebrew and in Greek. So again, we've got to be cautious. The Spirit of God, or the wind of God. Wind is powerful. Wind brings change. You can see why the words were connected. It's the same word in the original. That's how the Old Testament saw the Spirit of God. A term for God's outgoing energy, and wind is an expression of energy. And wind enables things to happen in the world, and indeed if you're walking against it in us. The wind of God, the Spirit of God, God's energy in the world that makes things happen in the physical world and in the human world. That's the Old Testament picture, and it's a pretty good picture when it's taken into the New Testament. Darkness speaks of something needing to be done. The Spirit of God, the energy of God, something would be done. Hovering over the waters, it's a picture like an eagle hovering over the land or over the water. That's a beautiful picture. God was about to come and bring order by his Spirit. And each time it says, and God said, let there be light. And light and darkness were separated. Let there be an expanse. And there was an expanse, a gap between the waters up in the sky and the waters in the sea. Let the dry ground appear, and vegetation follows, a separation of the land from the sea, allowing plant life to develop. Let there be lights, the creation of the sun, moon and stars. And again, reminding you, strongly emphasizing the word creation of sun, moon and stars. The word create means create from nothing, because the other accounts saw the sun, moon and stars as gods. Not so, says Genesis. They're just physical objects that God made. Let the water teem, let the birds fly, and sea creatures and birds come on the scene. Let the land produce, and we have the creation of animals and humans. But it is, and God said, this is so different from the other accounts, where gods were struggling with things or struggling with each other. The account here is so pointed, and God said, and it just happened. An announcement, a command, and it was so. And God saw it was good. It is so simple and straightforward and stands in stark contradiction to so much of the other accounts in existence. The word of command, and it just happened exactly as the command said. God is all-powerful. That's the picture the author is presenting. And the word good means fit for purpose. Because as I will see in a moment, the world was left for us humans to look after, but it was fit for purpose, but it needs to be maintained and looked after. But we'll come to that in a moment. Some key principles in all of this. There's no hint in this of a universe that was there already, which was a picture that other accounts sometimes gave, that the gods just manipulated what was there, leaving it unclear as to how it was there, why it was there. No, God made it out of nothing. And there's no concept of any struggle. Again, in contrast to previous accounts. And God said, and it happened. It's not some sort of divine breathing out, something that comes out of a bit of God coming out. It's just made by divine command. And it's not the same as the Creator. Oh, how often religion gets us confused and sees God in everything. Well, God is in everything in the sense that God made everything, and therefore it's his handiwork. In the same way as we see something of an artist in the picture they have painted. But the picture is not the artist, and the universe is not God. It's separate from God, and that's an important principle. And there wasn't a series of other gods that were kind of go-betweens that were doing bits and pieces. God, the self-existent one, the Lord of glory, the majestic one, just said, and it came into being. That's a magnificent picture, and it's very different from the pictures that existed at the time. In the previous presentation, I showed you some of this. The days, a separation of light, a separation of sky and sea, a separation of land for plant life. And then there's a beautiful pattern. The creation of lights, the creation of creatures to fill the sky and sea, and the creation of creatures to live in the land and use the plant food. The days is a literary device. It would be totally understood that way at the time. And indeed, if we look at history, it's been understood that way down through history until very recent times. No one ever dreamt of these as being days as we conceptualize a day today, starting at midnight and going to midnight. That's not the way the writer would have used it. It's not the way the language, the cultural literary forms of the day would have conceptualized it at all. It's just a way to bring it in clear memory, to present a picture, to get truths across. It's a literary device. And we're living in the seventh day. What a beautiful picture. How different from the other accounts. Remember, there were three words that are related to creation. Bara. Only God can do that. Creative, bringing into being something that did not exist before. And that's used very specifically. The more common word, but the emphasis on who does it, not how it's done. And that's important if we're going to interpret the first chapter of Genesis correctly. It doesn't address how the act was done. That's not the purpose of the author. It addresses the fact that God did it. And then purposeful creation. Transforming something into something else for purpose and for success. And the writer of Genesis has used the words with great skill and accuracy. We've got to take that into account. It's only used of the creation of the heavens and the earth. That's everything. And later it talks about looking back at all creation. Specifically, it's emphasized male and female. Both genders were created by God. Neither is superior. And then the one I picked out before was this surprise, sea monsters. And that simply reflects that sea monsters were seen at that time as being kind of evil gods that emerged from the deep waters of the sea. In fact, the sea was often seen as a kind of store of evil, simply because they didn't understand it and it was terrifying to them. This account makes it clear God made the sea and the sea monsters, whoever these monsters may be, whales, sharks, big fish, they were just made by God. They're life forms. These are the familiar words of the creation of humans. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female, he created them. Let's look at it in a little bit more depth. Did you notice the plural? But it goes with the make singular. Plural. God is not just like a human being. I pointed out in the previous presentation the danger of reading too much into this word Adam in English. The Hebrew word there is translated as mankind. Let us make mankind in our image. So God created mankind, male and female. He created them. The make there is the common word for make, emphasizing who was doing it. But the words there are specifically the word bara, create. Subtle use of language. And in these days, it's worth remembering that we are sent into this world and exist here to look after the world and not exploit it. And there is a theory that is often passed around that this world is just going to sink and get lower and get worse, and then God will take us all away to heaven and the world will be destroyed, so what's the point in looking after the world? It's all going to be finished anyway. That's not what this account is saying. We humans have a responsibility to look after this world and to look after all the creatures of this world and their environment. And the big issues today of overpopulation, pollution, global warming, the exploitation of oil and gas to the destruction of the environment, even issues relating to the use of nuclear energy. All of these are issues that we've got to bring and think about in the light of this, the plan of God. This world God made good, and we have no right just to exploit it mercilessly for our own benefit. Let's look a little further at this bit at the beginning. Now that phrase there has got a slightly greater emphasis on outer likeness. It's not a common word, but where it's used in the Old Testament, it almost always refers to something that connects to the outer likeness. Whereas that phrase there is more like the inner likeness, and that's a much more common phrase. We've got to be careful understanding this. God said, "Let us make mankind, you and me, outwardly like God, inwardly like God." What does that mean? We can see an example of this by seeing exactly the same phrase relating to the birth of Seth. You see, a child is outwardly like the parents. and inwardly, in terms of character, behaviour and nature, reflects something of the genes of the parents too. And that perhaps gives us a kind of clue about what is meant by this phrase. You see, we were created by God. And I'm going to suggest that outwardly, it lies in what we do. We're doing what God does. Hold that a second. But inwardly, we are like God in what we are. So perhaps that's the outward image, and that's the inward likeness. Let's see what that means. God left us human beings to look after this, his creation. That's someone else's phrase, God's vice-regents on earth. We are doing it on his behalf, at his command. Outwardly, we do what God has done. It's an interesting observation that one of the most incredible things about human beings is our creativity, often squeezed out of us by education systems that have gone astray. But creativity is the natural thing that we humans are doing. And you just need to look around, and we look at the creations that we have generated in this world. From the vitally important but simple thing of someone creating a beautiful garden behind their house, even though it's a small space. Perhaps a wife creating a loving, homely, well-organised house inside and creatively using the resources available. And we can take it right up to the creation of the wonders of the world, like the Fourth Rail Bridge, Concorde, the great steamers of the 19th and early 20th century that traversed the world, spacecraft that have taken men to the moon. We could go on forever. The great creations of anesthetics, antiseptics, and the great creations of nuclear magnetic resonance spectrometers that allow doctors to see inside the soft tissue of our bodies and diagnose problems. Creativity, God created the entire universe, and we are outwardly like him in our creativity, and that's perhaps just one part of it. But the other part is that. It's difficult to define and describe, but within all human beings there's a sensitivity to what we could loosely call the spiritual. It shows itself in varieties of ways. Sometimes it's very suppressed. But there is an instinctiveness in all human beings, a sensitivity towards that which is beyond us, a sensitivity to God, sometimes not recognized. We're capable of a spiritual response. And in that sense, we're like God, who is a spiritual being. There's a thought about in his image and likeness. Bringing a bit of it together. Created to be like God outwardly in what we do, and inwardly in what we are, spiritual beings. Created as the pinnacle of creation at the end of it. Created to multiply. We've got to be cautious and responsible about that, because we human beings have multiplied rather too successfully in some parts of the world. And now we're outrunning the resources available to us. And we've used our creativity into birth control to bring a balance, because there are some parts of the world where we are just creating new life for poverty. And that was never God's intention. We were created to manage God's creation, including our creativity and our procreativity. We are responsible beings because that's the way God made us. And in equality. Oh, it's been a hard, long battle, which is still not won. For in many areas of life, women do not enjoy equality of status with men. And in some parts of the world, it's a very serious imbalance. That's not God's intention. We're all human beings together. It's interesting that God blessed people. Come back to a moment to reflect on that. But I want us to digress for a second or two on that great chapter on blessing, blessedness, Deuteronomy 28. Here is my summary of it in my own words. Read these verses and see whether you think I've got this right. A person who's blessed carries enhanced respect and reputation with those around. This is the picture that Deuteronomy gives. A fruitful family life. Now, of course, blessedness at the time when this was all written was seen in terms of being the parent of many children, because in the children lay their future. Societies aren't quite the same today. Blessedness is not having riches, but it is having enough to meet all the needs. And not being defeated by the enemies all around. I've called it the powers of darkness, the evil one. Being established as a holy people, a people set apart for God to serve God and to do God's work and to bless others. Success at every turn in the workplace. Now, in those days, the workplace was almost entirely agriculture. Today, it's much more diverse. But success, in control of events, not being pushed around by events, with a full and healthy life and lifestyle. Now, that's the picture that's given of blessedness in Deuteronomy 28. Taking that in mind, let's look at that wonderful quotation, which I think captures so much of the meaning of this verse in Genesis. You see, today we talk of success. The great musicians, pop stars, footballers, speakers, politicians, whoever it might be. Power, reputation, and money. That's not an Old Testament thought. It talks of blessing. And the Deuteronomy picture is a good picture of it. Have you ever thought about it? That's what God wants for your life. That's His plan and His purpose. Blessing. What a great picture. At various stages, it refers to God saw that it was good, but at the end He said it was very good. Fit for purpose. That's what the context and the word means. That the universe God made was designed for a purpose. In the context of what Genesis and the author of Genesis was seeing a world that was flat, centered in the Middle East, with a dome above it, into which were studded the stars, only to be seen at night when it was dark enough, and the sun and the moon giving light, and the world that was made, and the creation of the animals and the plants in the world, fit for purpose. The purpose of God for humankind. The purpose for human beings made in the image and likeness of God to do God's work and to relate to God. And God saw that all that he had made, and it was very good. And it summarises it. It's a pity the chapter break comes at the end of chapter 1. It's the wrong place for it. They were completed. Now there's an interesting comment. The creation was completed and rest followed. But what's rest? Did God just stop doing anything at this stage? We're living on the seventh day. Does God never work today? What's the key to understanding this? And it comes from the letter to the Hebrews, where the author there picks up the idea of rest and presents it in three settings. He refers to the rest that God enjoyed after creation, a rest that God is still enjoying. He refers to the rest the Israelites failed to enjoy because they ended up dying in the wilderness, in the Sinai Peninsula, because of their lack of faith, and they never got into the promised land. Now those that did get in, which was the next generation, rest did not mean they were sitting about doing nothing. And then he speaks about the rest open to all the followers of Jesus. I'm going to suggest this. Rest expresses the will of God brought to completion. The will of God was that the people of Israel would enter the promised land, brought to completion. It didn't happen for that generation, it happened for the next. But the creation of the entire physical universe was completed. That's the will of God brought to completion. That's what it means by God rested. He didn't have to create again. It does not imply, and if we track the word rest throughout the Bible, it's very clear. It does not imply that God is doing nothing. That God has set this universe in motion and just stood back and lets it to run like a clockwork machine, expanding out into space, as the astronomers have shown us it's doing and has always done. That's not the picture. Not the picture of the word rest. God is still active in his world. He's still active in human lives. He's still there to have interrelationships with us. But God's rest is that what he intended to do was completed. The creation of the entire physical universe was completed. Looking at this whole passage overall, we can underestimate the impact. The problem is we're familiar with much of this, but when this was presented, it would have had a huge impact because, you see, it contradicted so much of what conventional belief that came out of other writings. This was a totally new insight. When you read the other accounts, they're as different as chalk from cheese compared to Genesis. It has a majesty and a simplicity and an authority that the other accounts don't have. They're unbelievable, literally unbelievable. But for us today, the ideas have become kind of woven into the fabric of our society, not always woven in correctly. We've got a lot of confusions in this, and I'm going to address some of these confusions later on in this series, because we need to face this and straighten it out. But this section is giving fundamental principles. The whole of the rest of the book of Genesis is built on them. Indeed, the whole of the rest of the Bible is built upon them. The rest of Genesis specifically gives 10 family histories. But it's based on these first few verses of Genesis. And the significance of all of this hasn't diminished. We need to recapture its significance. We need to rethink our lives, our practices, our beliefs, how we look at things, based on what the writer has said here in this chapter in Genesis. Just summarizing it. The self-existent one who made everything. Now he created order in this universe. He built it in from the outset. The world of the scientists, my world, all we're doing is trying to find out the principles by which this universe runs. And down through the centuries, great scientists have often seen it that way. I think it started with Isaac Newton, who saw himself as making sense of the divine patterns underpinning the physical universe. You can't do science if there isn't order. If things don't stay constant and don't move in a constant way, science becomes impossible. But we've a job. We've a job to look after this world. It's God's world. He made it. And he's left us to act on his behalf. Yes, we're to procreate and be fruitful, but with responsibility. In God's plan, that's our position. And everything he made was for our benefit and support. But we have to look after it. You see, God has given to us the responsibility to look after this planet. And he's given us the responsibility to respond to him with our spiritual nature. The world, the universe that God made was fit for purpose. Our responsibility is to look after it. That's the kind of summary of these opening parts. Now in the next presentation, I'm going to look at the rest of chapter 2, and I've entitled this, Life on Earth.